All right, we're going to be working on making mayonnaise today and a variation on it, which I believe is called aioli, but I'm not very good at pronouncing words that I've only read. But the first thing that we need is just an egg yolk. And so I'm going to work on how do you separate the egg yolk from the egg white. So whenever it says in a recipe, separate the egg, you're going to separate the egg yolk from the egg white. So you just want to crack it on one side and then open it over the top of a bowl. And you're going to try and keep the yolk in the egg itself, but let the white pour out. And if you cut it evenly, you can kind of put the yolk back and forth between the two eggshells until they separate, and then just put them in separate containers. So we can work with the egg yolk. We're going to save the egg white and use it later for a variation on the recipe to just kind of show us what the egg yolk is using. Okay, so your recipe says that you can work with a whisk to combine this together. And this does work. It takes a while with a whisk because you have to use a lot of arm power to really get it working. We're going to use a food processor, which is a faster way, but it does have the disadvantage of constantly needing to stop, open the container, and close the container, as you'll see in a minute. So we are going to be combining some oil and some lemon juice, and then some salt and pepper for some flavoring, and an egg yolk. Now, oil is, like fats, non-polar, and lemon juice in water is going to be very polar. And so normally these things don't mix together very well. Like water and oil don't mix together, they'll separate out. So if I were to just put the lemon juice into the oil, we would get two layers and they wouldn't mix together. So we are going to use the egg yolk as what's called an emulsifier. So an emulsifier has parts that are polar, like the lemon juice, and parts that are non-polar, like the oil. And so they're going to help hold those two together. But we have to get these working. We have to separate out the phospholipids so that they can work as the emulsifier. So the phospholipids are the actual specific name of the emulsifiers in here. Now, you may have seen on ingredient lists for things lecithin. So lecithin is the phospholipid that's in eggs. It's also found in soy. So you might see egg lecithin or soy lecithin. And that's in the ingredients of whatever you're looking at to hold together the oils and fats along with the sugars and the other polar regions. It is important to pay attention to the beginning of the recipe because we're not going to dump everything together. So at first it says we're going to add our egg yolk. So just the yolk, not the entire egg. And we're going to add our salt and pepper. We're going to add a teaspoon of hot water and a teaspoon of lemon juice. And we're going to add just 1 tablespoon of oil. So this is just going to be enough to help break up that egg yolk and really get the emulsifiers out where they can be useful to us. So now that we have all these together, we can put them in the food processor. So with this food processor, what we're going to do first is we're going to take the, let me move this out of the way, we're going to take the blades and put them on top of the container and screw that into place so that we don't have any leakage. And let me see if I can tilt the camera up so we can. And so the way this one happens to work, just by pushing down, it's going to mix, and we only need to pulse it, which means it only needs to go a second or two at a time, and we'll do this a few times until it looks like everything is blended together. so looking inside, that's starting to look like everything's pretty well mixed. I don't see a pool of oil on one side or any of the lemon juice on the other. I'm going to give it one more go. And then what we're going to do is just add a little bit of oil at a time, pulse it a few times, and then continue that process over and over again until we've added about a third, a quarter to a third of the oil we're going to add. So I just added a tablespoon more oil, not a ton of oil, but I didn't measure it out either. So at this point, it still has that yellow color of the egg yolk. And what you'll notice is that as I continue doing this process, it's going to get lighter and lighter. All right, at this point I've added about a third of the cup of oil. You can see it's quite a bit thicker, but it's still liquidy. At this point I can start adding a little bit more oil at a time. It seems to be holding together, not separating. So I'm going to add a little bit more oil each time. I'm not going to add it all at once, but I'm a little bit more at a time. At this point, you should really start to see this thickening up. You can see how that kind of stays together. It's not acting as liquidy. So once you start seeing that really starting to thicken, then you can add the oil a little bit more at a time, but continue to pulse. And you'll probably want to pulse at least 10 times in between. Okay, so here is our mayonnaise that group 1 was to make. You can see it's nice and thick. I probably added the oil a little bit too quickly. There are a few pockets of oil in there, but we do have a nice mayonnaise there that you could use on sandwiches. So now I'm going to continue adding oil to the same mixture to see how much oil we can add to just that one egg yolk and still continue to have a mayonnaise. Okay, so since my first trial of the regular recipe of mayonnaise was separating a little, I decided to start again. So you can see this worked out much better. I did end up finishing it with a motorized whisk, so you can see here it's got a cord there, rather than doing it in the food processor. So my guess is that allows a little bit more air to get in there. All right, this is after adding an extra half cup of oil. You can see it's starting to lighten in color and be a little more white than just yellow. The pepper is spreading out quite a bit, and it's still very thick. So the oil is still being incorporated here when we have 1.5 cups per 1 yolk of egg. So here's my mayonnaise after adding almost 2 cups of oil. So you can see it's still quite thick and white. It's just getting to the point where it's kind of hard to incorporate it, so I don't want to over mix it at this point. My understanding is you can continue to add the oil for another couple of cups. It doesn't necessarily make appetizing mayonnaise the more you add, but it will continue to blend in so you have a nice mixture. Okay, so for this trial, what we're going to do is we have all of our ingredients in here except for the oil. I'm going to add all of the oil at once and see what the effect is on making our mayonnaise, and so we can see why it is we add it just a little at a time. So this is after we've mixed it for a while, and you can see this is almost watery in consistency, so it's very different. It doesn't have that thickness because it wasn't able to incorporate in the air and to mix in the oil and the water together. And if we let this sit for a while, we'll start to see a separation between the oil layer and the smaller water layer. So this is the adding oil all at once trial, and we can see that the salt and pepper layer has all gone to the top, and the bottom part is the oilier part. So we have a separation of those two. And then there's probably some water down at the bottom as well. And it's still quite liquidy. So mixing it all at once does not work. Here is one last look at our overmixed container, and you can see the oil is starting to come to the surface there. You can see the layer of oil there. So when we dump in the oil all at once, then we don't end up with an effective emulsion. Okay, so on this trial, I've got my tablespoon of oil, I've got my salt and pepper, and my lemon juice and hot water in here. But instead of adding a yolk, I'm going to add that egg white that we had before. So this is just so we have, you know, a similar volume, but it's not the part of the egg that has the emulsifier in it. Now, the white of the egg does have proteins, and proteins are good at emulsifying air, but the pockets for emulsion are very small, unlike the long chains of the fatty acids. So let's see how well this works. All right, at this point I've added about a 1/4 cup of oil. So when we were doing the original recipe, this was nice and thick. You can see here it's foamy on top. It is whiter because we don't have the egg yolk, but it's very watery. Now I'm not going to waste the oil by adding more to this, because the egg white is never going to let this get thick. So with the egg white, this is what it looks like. So the moral of the story is that our egg yolk is very good as an emulsifier, which is a compound that can help oily things like vegetable oil mix well with polar things like water or lemon juice or vinegar or sugar.